I remember the phone call like it was a thunderclap. The voice on the other end was hesitant, almost trembling, as if it feared the words it had to say. "Mrs. Whitmore, there's been an accident. Your son." The rest blurred into a fog of disbelief and sharp, piercing pain. Michael was gone. My chest tightened. My hands shook. And the house that had been so full of his laughter and energy now felt impossibly empty. I wandered through the living room we had shared for decades, staring at the photographs lining the shelves, Michael as a boy, his first science fair trophy, the family vacations we had taken together. Each image was a dagger, a reminder that the future I had imagined, the quiet dinners, the holidays filled with joy, the dreams we had discussed late at night had vanished in an instant. Then Vanessa appeared. She wasn't in mourning. She was in a crisp white suit, her expression unreadable, her movements precise, businesslike. She swept past me, her expensive perfume trailing behind, and in that moment, I realized she had already claimed everything my son had worked for: the house, his investments, every tangible piece of his life, now under her control. And then the words fell like a hammer. "You don't belong here. Pack your things. Leave." The casual cruelty in her voice was unbearable. I felt like a shadow of the man Michael had loved, a ghost of the family he had trusted me to preserve. For the first time, I understood the depth of her ambition and the thin veneer of civility she wore. I picked up my coat slowly, steadying my trembling hands. Each step toward the door felt like crossing a chasm I hadn't prepared for. The lock clicked behind me, final and unyielding, and I stepped out into the cold, gray light, carrying the weight of loss, betrayal, and the first stirrings of resolve that would carry me forward into the uncertain days ahead. The words hit me before I could even process their meaning. "Go die in a dumpster." Vanessa's voice was sharp, clipped, and devoid of any humanity. For a moment, I froze, unable to respond, as if the sentence itself had anchored me to the spot. My son was gone, and the woman who had been his wife, someone I had trusted, someone I had welcomed into our lives, was now treating me as if I were nothing more than refuse to be discarded. I felt the raw edge of humiliation press against my chest. Every memory of Michael flashed before my eyes. His first steps, the nights we stayed up finishing science projects together, the quiet mornings when he would sit across the breakfast table and dream aloud of the life he wanted to build. And now, all of it was under the shadow of Vanessa's arrogance, her calculated indifference. She moved through the house like a conqueror surveying a captured kingdom. Her heels clicked against the polished hardwood, her eyes cold and assessing, lingering on the photographs, the furniture, the artifacts of a life she had no part in creating. I recognized the same precision and intensity in her demeanor that Michael had once possessed. Yet it was twisted by self-interest, devoid of compassion. I realized in that moment that my grief was compounded by disbelief, not at the accident that had taken Michael, but at the audacity of someone to seize everything he had built without so much as a thought for the people who had nurtured him. My sense of identity, so entwined with this house, with the life we had carved out together, was under attack. I drew a slow, steadying breath and held my head high. I would not allow this moment to define me entirely. The humiliation stung, sharp and bitter, yet it ignited something else, a cautious awareness that patience, clarity, and perhaps strategy would serve me far better than anger alone. I turned toward the door, leaving the room that had been both sanctuary and battlefield, knowing that the next steps I took would determine whether this betrayal would break me or become the foundation of my reclamation. leading me inevitably toward the confrontation that awaited in the coming days. As I walked through the empty rooms, my mind carried me back 20 years to a time when Michael's laughter filled every corner of this house. I remembered the first day we stepped onto the unfinished floorboards, both of us kneeling on the raw wood, hammering planks into place. He was barely 16, his hands clumsy but determined, insisting that this house would be ours, a place for family, for dreams. I had watched him with pride, pushing through the exhaustion of my own long days, knowing that the hours I gave were building more than walls, they were building his future. The library was the crown jewel. Michael had spent weeks arguing over the placement of each shelf, each book, each lamp. We painted late into the night, our voices hushed but excited, imagining the worlds we would discover together through the novels he cherished. I had spent hours hunting for first editions, scribbled notes, college textbooks full of his annotations, tiny windows into the mind of the boy who had grown into the man I adored. Every book, every shelf, every corner carried his essence. And in protecting it, I had felt a purpose deeper than my own grief or ambitions. I thought of the startup he had begun in our basement, the one that kept him awake for nights on end. Fueled by caffeine and ambition, I had given him my savings, my trust, and my unwavering belief that his vision was worth every risk. I had worked 2 jobs at the time, leaving little for myself, just to ensure that Michael could pursue what I knew was his calling. Those sacrifices had been invisible to most, yet they had shaped the trajectory of his life, laying the foundation for everything he had achieved. Now, standing in these halls, I realized that the weight of legacy was more than money or walls. It was the accumulation of years, effort, love, and trust, the unseen threads that bound family together. Vanessa had inherited a fortune, a house, a life meticulously built, yet she had no understanding of the sweat and devotion embedded within it. My memories, my sacrifices, my son's spirit, they were far more valuable than any account balance, and in protecting them, I felt the first stirrings of resolve. The house was quiet again, but I could hear Michael's voice in my mind, reminding me of what mattered. Every detail I remembered strengthened my purpose. I straightened, breathed deeply, and prepared myself to face what came next, knowing that the confrontation with Vanessa was inevitable. The day we met with Henry Collins felt like stepping into another world, one where grief and anger collided with cold, precise legality. I sat across from Vanessa, her back straight, hands neatly folded, the picture of control and confidence. Collins cleared his throat and began to read the last will and testament of my son, Michael Whitmore. Each word struck me like a hammer. Vanessa was to inherit everything the house, all financial portfolios, investments, and assets totaling $75 million. My name appeared only once, a sterile acknowledgement buried in a single line to Eleanor Whitmore. I extend my gratitude for being a loving mother. That was it. No recognition of sacrifices. No mention of the hours we spent building this life together. No nod to the legacy I had helped nurture. I felt erased, invisible in the story of my own family. My hands gripped the armrests as Colin's voice carried on. And yet, beneath the surface of legalese, I caught subtle hints, phrases, and clauses that seemed almost too deliberate. Michael had anticipated more than just Vanessa's ambition. There were contingencies, carefully crafted instructions buried like seeds, meant to sprout if certain conditions were met. A faint spark of understanding flickered through my despair. Perhaps this was not the end, but the first move of a plan he had designed, knowing he might not be here to see it unfold. the cold fury settled like ice in my chest. I had been humiliated, dismissed, and sidelined. Yet the awareness that Michael had thought this through steadied me. He had left behind not only wealth, but a framework for justice. If only I had the clarity and patience to follow it. I exhaled slowly and stood, straightening my back, the first threads of purpose weaving through my grief. The confrontation with Vanessa was no longer only about what had been taken, it was about executing what Michael had left me to carry forward. I gathered my coat and followed Collins toward the car, knowing that the next steps would take me closer to understanding the full extent of my son's final plan. I drove through the gray streets of suburban Chicago, the house shrinking behind me in the rearview mirror, carrying with me the weight of loss, betrayal, and a growing determination I had not yet fully understood. The rain-slicked roads reflected the dim streetlights, blurring the edges of the city, as if the world itself had become a landscape of uncertainty. I did not want friends. I did not want comfort. I needed solitude, a place where I could think without interruption, a quiet room where grief and strategy could coexist. The Starlight Motel, a nondescript building on the outskirts of the city, became my temporary refuge. The room was small, the furnishings plain, but that was precisely what I needed. Here, there was no pretense, no one to impress, no one to provoke panic or pride. I placed my suitcase carefully on the worn luggage rack and sank into the chair, letting the silence wrap around me. It was a silence charged with possibility, heavy, but not suffocating. I reflected on Michael, his meticulous nature, his foresight, his unwavering moral compass. The more I thought about him, the more I understood that this inheritance, this house, this fortune, had never been just about money. It was about legacy, about testing character, about ensuring that the life he had built would endure the worst of human nature. Vanessa's arrogance had been predictable, her greed obvious. He had anticipated it, and in that anticipation, he had created the framework for justice. Yet even as purpose stirred, I felt the familiar tension of grief and anger. Could I act with patience when my emotions demanded retribution? Could I navigate the narrow path between morality and strategy without faltering? Each thought, each memory, each calculation weighed against the raw ache of losing my son. I closed my eyes and let the rhythm of the highway fade into the background, focusing instead on the pieces of the plan I could begin to see. This withdrawal was not defeat, it was preparation. The first step in a strategy that required calm, precision, and restraint. I picked up the phone, traced the number I had memorized, and pressed it with deliberate care. The next phase of Michael's plan waiting to unfold. From the quiet of the motel room, I could already feel the first stirrings of control returning, a signal that the game was far from over. The line clicked, and Henry Collins's voice filled the room, steady and precise, yet carrying the weight of the secret he was about to reveal. I listened intently, each word sharpening the edge of my awareness. "Eleanor," he began. Michael was far more careful than you might have realized. He anticipated every possible move Vanessa could make. I felt a cold spark ignite inside me. Anticipated. How had he foreseen this cruelty? Collins continued, explaining the intricacies of the will. A fiduciary duty clause had been embedded. A 30-day evaluation designed to test Vanessa's character and her commitment to the family legacy. It was subtle, almost invisible, yet enforceable with precise legal authority. Every action she took, every indulgence, every decision would either satisfy the clause or trigger consequences she could not foresee. My mind raced. The humiliation, the eviction, the complete disregard for all that Michael and I had built. These were not accidents or careless oversight. They were the first moves in a game he had anticipated. A test he had designed, knowing I might be the one left to execute it. I was no longer merely a grieving mother. I was entrusted with carrying out the plan he had left in place for moments exactly like this. Collins outlined the contingencies Vanessa's impatience and her desire for immediate control would become her undoing. The very extravagance and hubris that had infuriated me were now instruments of justice, calibrated to expose her failings. My role was to observe, to remain hidden, and to act only when the conditions Michael had foreseen were met. I sat back in the motel chair, absorbing the weight of this revelation. The grief that had clouded my mind shifted into clarity, replacing despair with purpose. I realized that Michael had not only protected the family legacy but had also protected me, even in his absence. The path ahead was clear, though delicate. Every step had to be measured, every silence intentional. I hung up the phone and exhaled, letting the gravity of responsibility settle around me. The game was set, and now it was my turn to play. Carefully, patiently, and with unwavering resolve. The next morning, I reviewed the plan in my mind, preparing for the first moves that would test Vanessa's character and bring Michael's hidden justice into motion. From the quiet of my motel room, I watched as Vanessa's days unfolded like a spectacle of excess. Luxury cars were ordered and delivered before she had even slept past sunrise. Boutique after boutique called her name, and she moved through them with the air of someone claiming what was hers by right. She hired designers to tear apart the warmth of the house we had built, replacing familiar wood and leather with sleek, sterile surfaces that left the rooms hollow and unrecognizable. Her overconfidence was palpable. She laughed at minor inconveniences, waved off concerns about timelines and contracts, and brushed aside subtle legal cautions. Every action she took, every decision made in haste, reinforced a pattern I had long anticipated. Michael had known her temperament, her impatience, her inability to consider consequences beyond immediate gratification. I observed silently, noting how her indulgence grew more brazen by the hour. The way she flaunted wealth, the way she assumed control, revealed cracks beneath the polished exterior. Each misplaced gesture, each dismissive glance, was a hint at vulnerability she did not recognize in herself. It became clear that her arrogance, her blind pursuit of immediate satisfaction, was shaping the path she would inevitably stumble upon. Every impulsive choice she made, every attempt to consolidate power without patience, edged her closer to the consequences Michael had meticulously prepared. I leaned back in my chair, letting the scene unfold without interference, understanding that the stakes were not just financial, but moral, and the lessons Michael had left behind required careful observation. Her hubris was a force of its own making, and all I needed was patience to let it work against her. By the end of the day, the first signs of tension had begun to appear, small but unmistakable, signaling that the next phase of the plan, where her overconfidence would meet its designed consequences, was about to begin. Vanessa's world, once gleaming and effortless, began to crumble in ways she had not anticipated. One by one, her attempts to access accounts or authorize payments were met with unexpected barriers. A credit card linked to the estate declined repeatedly. Wire transfers stalled, and requests for immediate liquidity were postponed by standard procedural requirements. Each delay was deliberate, subtle, and calculated, but to her, it felt like chaos striking at the heart of her control. I watched quietly from my vantage point, noting every flicker of disbelief, every exasperated gesture. The composure she had worn like armor started to crack, replaced by visible tension. Calls to banks, designers, and contractors yielded polite refusals. Explanations couched in legal language she had little patience for. The luxury she had indulged in, the cars, the renovations, the extravagant shopping suddenly became inaccessible, and her carefully orchestrated control began to feel like sand slipping through her fingers. Each action she took to reclaim authority only pushed her further into the constraints of the trap Michael had set in motion. The more aggressively she tried to override the procedures, the more the system responded with measured resistance. Her frustration built quietly, simmering beneath a surface of disbelief and denial. I could sense the panic rising, a crescendo that Michael had known she could not resist pushing to its limits. As I observed, the calm clarity of my purpose solidified. I remained a silent presence, a shadow moving through the edges of her world, untouched by her agitation, guided only by the instructions Michael had left and the knowledge that patience and precision would accomplish what force never could. By the end of the day, the first true signs of desperation had begun to show. Every blocked transaction, every frustrated call, was another step toward the consequences she could no longer evade. And the next phase of the plan, the point where her own impulses would deliver the final blow, was set to unfold. The day Vanessa finally realized the extent of her powerlessness arrived quietly, yet with an intensity that could not be ignored. One by one, her attempts to reclaim control were thwarted. Every account she tried to access was frozen, every transfer blocked, every purchase stalled by procedural requirements executed with deliberate precision. The world she had built on arrogance and entitlement suddenly felt constricted, like a gilded cage closing around her. I watched her struggle unfold from the margins, noting the sharp contrast between her frantic movements and the calm that settled over me. Vanessa's composure, so carefully constructed, began to fracture. She phoned bankers, lawyers, and contractors, each time meeting polite refusals, explanations couched in the authority of procedure, the law, and Michael's careful planning. Every action she took in anger only strengthened the mechanisms of her own undoing. Her panic grew with each passing hour. The extravagant lifestyle she had taken for granted, the luxury cars, the boutique shopping, the interior renovations was rendered irrelevant by her inability to touch a single account. Her frustration became palpable, visible even to a casual observer. Each futile attempt to assert authority only exposed the hubris she had carried like armor, revealing the vulnerability she had never acknowledged. I remained silent, unmoved, observing as her confidence and entitlement collapsed under the weight of the structures Michael had left behind. Every denied transaction, every delayed order, every rebuffed call reinforced the clarity of purpose I felt. Patience had become my instrument, and restraint my shield. Michael's strategy was unfolding precisely as he had intended, and I was the executor of his foresight. By the afternoon, Vanessa's desperation had reached its peak. She no longer moved with certainty, but with frantic recklessness, each step driving her closer to the consequences that had been patiently waiting for her. The final confrontation was approaching, the moment when justice would no longer require patience or subtlety, and when the carefully orchestrated plan would reveal its ultimate purpose. Sitting at the head of the polished conference table, I felt the weight of responsibility settle comfortably on my shoulders. Michael's vision, meticulously documented in his trust, was now mine to execute. The Peterson Legacy Trust would fund the Tech Scholars Foundation, providing scholarships and resources for children who had never been given the opportunities he had fought for. Every decision I made honored his foresight and his principles, a living testament to his life and character. Vanessa was present only in the shadows of her own choices. Her access to the estate had been reduced to a modest monthly stipend, contingent on employment and accountability. The lavish world she had envisioned had evaporated, replaced by a life of ordinary responsibilities, a reality shaped by the consequences of her greed. I walked through the classrooms, the computers, and the bustling labs, seeing the spark of curiosity in the students' eyes. Each accomplishment, each discovery, each small triumph was a reminder that Michael's true legacy was not the wealth he left behind, but the doors he had built for others to pass through. I took a deep breath and allowed a quiet smile to cross my face. The house, the money, the betrayals, they were no longer the measure of success. Purpose, responsibility, and the ability to cultivate a meaningful legacy had become my guiding compass. The work ahead was only beginning, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a profound sense of peace and clarity, ready to carry Michael's vision forward.